Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Falcons Central Radio on the Pro Football Central Radio Network. I am one of your hosts, Aaron Freeman, joined as usual by my co-host Matt Karoly. Today we are going to be talking about the potentially last of the Falcons coaching changes. We'll be talking about the East-West Shrine game, some of the standouts from that game, sort of the people we have our eyes on in the Senior Bowl. And of course, we'll be answering your mailbag questions. But first, we have to kick off things with the big event of the weekend, which is everybody's least favorite NFL team, at least everybody watching this show. The New Orleans Saints were incapable of advancing to the Super Bowl, thanks to a magnificent win by the Los Angeles Rams in overtime. And all worries about the Saints winning a Super Bowl in Atlanta's home stadium in Super Bowl 53 or whatever we're at now is wiped away thanks to the greatness of Greg Zuerlein, Young Jeezy, Sean McVay, Aaron Donald, all those great. Brandon Cooks, love you all. CJ Anderson, you're all great. But we wanted to start by just wishing our friends from Louisiana a little bit of happy trails. But Matt, I'll give you the floor.
Yeah, I mean, it really felt like a Falcons national holiday on Sunday night. And it was cool just seeing all the people on Twitter kind of throwing their dose of shade New Orleans way. But yeah, I wasn't very confident going into it. I don't know about yourself. And even when it happened, I was like, wow, this is crazy. But it's sweet the way it happened, just because we've seen the Saints get away with officiating benefiting them in most games. I mean, obviously,
A lot of home cooking.
yeah, last year's Falcons Saints game with the infamous Marshawn Holdemore, hugging Julio Jones near the end zone. Kind of a similar play. I mean, it wasn't as egregious because there wasn't helmet-to-helmet contact, but the fact that he got to Julio before the ball was there, very similar to Nickel Roby-Coleman with the no call that Saints fans are now butthurt about. But yeah, so for them to be on the short end of the stick and for that to cost them a trip to the Super Bowl, I mean, it doesn't get any sweeter if you're a Falcons fan. And honestly, you can't say anything more. I mean, it's great to be a Falcons fan for the simple fact that we don't have to worry and we can sleep easy that those New Orleans Saints fans aren't going to be entering Mercedes-Benz Stadium in 2 weeks.
Yeah. I know a lot of people are like, oh, but the Patriots, and it's like, I don't care about the Patriots. Like,
Yeah, I mean, what's one more for the Patriots, honestly?
We knew the Patriots couldn't make the Super Bowl anyway, so like,
right.
That's basically how it goes. But I just remember saying one thing about Nickel Roby before we move on. I remember like 2 years ago, I really wanted the Falcons to sign him in free agency, but I'll just sit here and say that I'm glad that didn't work out.
Yeah,
and he was able to basically, arguably single-handedly or single-helmetedly, in the Saints season and whatnot. But it's not as if that one play was what cost the Saints the game,
that's the big thing. I mean, they won the coin toss, and you thought at that point they were going to do the same thing that Patriots did to the Chiefs, was march down the field and score a touchdown. And the Rams made more plays, and again, I think the big thing for them is how the Rams went all in this season for the Super Bowl, and Dante Fowler was another one of those guys that they acquired midseason. He was the guy that got the pressure on Breeze, and Breeze threw up a duck, and John Johnson made a play on the ball. I mean, Michael Thomas, there was a video I saw on Twitter where Michael Thomas, I don't know what he was doing, but he had every opportunity to break that pass up and make it an incomplete. So, like you said, it wasn't just this no call. I mean, sure, it's egregious, and had it been called, the game's probably over, but there was plenty of opportunities where the Saints could have put the Rams away. I mean, let's not forget they had a 13-0 lead to start and a 20-10 lead in the second half. So the whole hashtag blew dat, I mean, they really did blow the game, because they had opportunities to put them away. They didn't do it, and the Rams made enough plays, made one more play than the Saints, and they deserve to move on.
Absolutely. So, I'm sure we will be talking more Saints trash, more
It's going to be a
Rams.
fun offseason, that's for sure.
Yeah. And look, I know people are like, hey, this is a Falcon show. But you mentioned it sort of the Rams going all in. And like they have a sort of, with the whole whether or not you can win a Super Bowl with a quarterback on a rookie contract. They have like what 3 more years of Jared Goff basically making pennies.
Hmm.
So if they can win a Super Bowl in that time, like that's sort of their window before they're going to have to, in addition to all the other guys that they've paid this offseason, they have to pay Jared Goff even more money. So like if they can take care of business this year, like I'm not going to be a hater or anything like that. I think the Rams are doing it right, and they're sort of
Well,
the team that
it's just like the Eagles too. I mean, they basically same exact thing. Now, obviously, they won the Super Bowl with their backup quarterback, and their guy was on the sidelines. But yeah, I mean, if you can get there and win the one while he's still on that rookie deal, you can put a couple together. Now, we see year after year, things change very quickly in the NFL. Seeing it with the Falcons. I mean, we were talking about the Falcons having one of the best rosters in football. Now I think people are forgetting about that, and that's not necessarily the case anymore. So, you never know year to year, but absolutely, I agree with you. If they can get the job done in 2 weeks, um, I do think they have a legitimate shot to string a couple together. Now, the one thing with them, though, I mean, they do have an aging offensive line. They do have guys like Talib and Marcus Peters. Their deals are going to be done pretty soon, so they do have decisions to make, and so I can easily see them maybe not necessarily like they have to draft well. I think honestly, if
yeah.
they want to keep this going a little bit more than the Eagles did. I mean, the Eagles had a rock solid foundation, and guys were all under contract, whereas the Rams is not necessarily the case, but. Again, salary cap can be manipulated, and as long as you get one under your belt, I mean, I think it makes 2 and 3 kind of come a lot easier.
Yeah, I mean, the main thing is, take advantage of the opportunities you have. So win this one this year because you're not guaranteed future ones.
Right.
As the Falcons, the Eagles, the Panthers, the Saints, the Packers, pretty much every team other than the Patriots can tell you over the last decade and whatnot. So if they can get this one, and obviously, if they can sort of beat the Patriots, that'll be great. Sort of a rematch of that Super Bowl almost 20 years ago where the Patriots won and was the beginning of their dynasty. So, it'd be sort of poetic if the end of the quote unquote Patriots dynasty is, put on by the
Falls on
Rams
the
and whatnot.
same day too. February 3rd was
Yeah.
when
So,
it kicked off.
yeah. So, that's going to be interesting to watch. And so I certainly am going to be rooting for the Rams to win because I just think it works. It makes sense. I have no ill will towards the Rams, even though they are technically a rival in the NFC, but that rivalry won't start until the day after the Super Bowl for at least me. Yeah, so that's the last thing I want to say. Let's sort of put a button on the Falcons coaching staff, although I guess we're going to get at least one more move in the future because of the departure of Kyle Flood, their assistant O-line coach, who was recently promoted to basically be the game management assistant coach or whatever, but he left to take the O-line coach duties at Alabama under Nick Saban. I don't know if that's a fair trade. We got Sark. They get Kyle Flood. We'll find out in the future. But the Falcons also sort of hired special teams coordinator Ben Kotwicka. I forget how to say his name. He's been with Washington the last couple of years. He worked with Dan Quinn during his days with the Jets. We'll see what he can do. The Falcons reshuffled their offensive assistant coaches. Bernie Parmalee is no longer the running backs coach. He served in that role for his first year last year in 2018. He's now the assistant special teams coach. He's going to be helping Kotwicka. Kotwicka, I don't know how to say his name. And Dave Brock will be the running backs coach. And they got rid of a couple of other low-level assistants, including Charlie Jackson and Todd Nielsen. Matt, do you have any thoughts on these moves?
So Katakwa is interesting. It really seems like a Dan Quinn hire. I mean, the strong military background that he has. We all know Dan Quinn's very pro-military, so I think those two are going to jive very well. And we're going to add another rah-rah type of guy into the locker room. which I think they needed a new voice there. Nothing against Keith Armstrong, and I'm not going to say he was bad or the performances of the special teams were on him, but I just think, like all coaches in the NFL, when you're there for a decade plus, it just becomes stale a little bit and guys can tune you out or whatnot. So having a fresh voice, probably a fiery voice, I don't know a lot about him, but I think he's a guy that's going to, like I said, mix well with Dan Quinn, and hopefully, give a little jolt to the special teams. His units in Washington weren't anything special. I think he had maybe a couple top 10 seasons, maybe ninth was the highest I think I saw from Football Outsiders, if I'm not mistaken. But yeah, we'll see what happens with him. I think it's a fit. As far as some of the repositioning, I mean, Bernie Parmalee did have, he does have a background in special teams, so it makes some sense there to give the new guy, some help since Parmalee's now been in the building for a year. Dave Brock going from wide receiver coach to running back. I don't know. I mean, it was a little shocking, I guess, but rather than bring in someone different, but hope for the best there. And then as far as, Kyle Flood, not a huge loss. I do know he seemed to have a pretty big impact on the O-line group, being the former assistant offensive line coach. So, you can say what you want about the offensive line regressing under him and Chris Morgan, but I do think stuff like that matters when guys, because a lot of those guys are still going to be in the building in 2019. So losing a coach like that they enjoyed playing for is never a positive. But yeah, hopefully they replace him. I'm going to continue to say Raheem Morris is the next man up as far as that game management coach is concerned. He has always seemed to be Dan Quinn's right hand man, and usually, that clock management coach is going to be saddled up right next to him on game days. So it wouldn't be a huge transition if Morris is given that role ultimately. But we'll see what happens.
Yeah, we'll see. We do have a question from Brian at your homeboy Brian on Twitter. Yes, do you think there is a good chance that Dan Quinn will be our defensive coordinator for multiple seasons if the defense plays well in 2019?
I don't see why not. I mean, if this was a temporary thing, it's a good question. I don't know. It's hard to know what the future holds. I mean, for me, if he does well, why would you give up those reins? And he has when he has been in control of the defense for those stints early on in the tenure, it's gone well. And I guess he had more faith in some of the assistants, and it didn't pan out. And now he's coaching for his job. So I think for me, obviously he's going to be the D coordinator in 2019. You'd like to think he would definitely be the one in 2020. And if he gets back to steady water where his job security is fairly intact, then maybe at that point he gives up those honors. But I don't know. What do you think?
I would say I would be skeptical of it for him to keep it for more than one season, just because it's just not a common occurrence that head coaches call the defense.
What about the offense, though?
I mean, it's a little different because I think, I think offense requires a little bit more hands-on management than defense does. So I think, a coach wanting to have that responsibility on offense makes a lot more sense than necessarily maintaining that responsibility on defense. Now, maybe you can argue because it doesn't necessarily require as much sort of hands-on management that it's easier for a coach to take a responsibility. It's just not a common occurrence is basically what I'm getting to. So I would think if, my theory on why Dan Quinn is taking over duties is basically to sort of, right the ship a little bit as opposed to steering the ship long term. So I think he's just trying to get it back on the right track. And then if he can do that, then I think he'll be willing to pass it off. Whether he does that, we'll have to see. Again, obviously, that depends on a lot of factors. Having a coach on staff, or potentially someone coming from elsewhere that he trusts in order to handle those responsibilities. But, right now, I think probably more than likely 2019 will be his only season in terms of calling defensive plays. But again, that's a guess more so than any sort of real insight into that. Okay, let's move on and talk about these all-star games. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the players that we thought stood out watching the Shrine game. Of course, we weren't there at practice. That occurred on Saturday afternoon, if you guys missed it. And you know, these are notable for Falcons, at least, and I think in large part due to the fact that Dan Quinn has final say over the 53-man roster, and because coaches can't really be involved in the draft process during the season. These all-star games, as well as the combine and whatnot, the offseason is really an opportunity for the Falcons coaching staff, and particularly Dan Quinn, to first get their eyeballs on some of these guys, and they can make a pretty positive impression of these for these coaches at these all-star games. And so we'll talk about some of the standouts that we saw in the Shrine game and heard some positive buzz during the practice week. And we'll sort of talk about some of the guys that we think are at least going to keep our eyes on, particularly in the trenches this week during the Senior Bowl, which you can check out their daily practices on NFL Network and whatnot. So let's start things off with the Shrine game, and Matt, sort of give us some of the guys that stood out to you, or that you heard some positive buzz about, that you have your eyes on as far as the Falcons are concerned moving forward.
So I think obviously given the Falcons' needs, along the trenches, we're going to spend a lot of attention talking about those types of guys. And there were two in particular that really helped their stock this past week, and that was defensive tackle Daniel Wise from Kansas and nose tackle Daylon Mack from Texas A&M. Those were the two that jumped out initially, both in practice and the games. And what I'll say about those guys, Daniel Wise, he was a guy at Kansas that played kind of all around the line, and I think that kind of hurt him. I mean, it showed his versatility, which will help him in that regard with scouts. But I think what they did in the Shrine Week was they played him at 3-tech. He measured in at 6'3", 284, so that's kind of your prototypical, 3-tech in the National Football League, and he had great success there. So he's a guy that's, in Atlanta, that would be his fit in Dan Quinn's scheme, is at that 3-tech, rotating in with Grady Jarrett, firing off the ball, controlling that gap. He had a great week there. And then Daylon Mack, former 5-star recruit from Texas A&M, kind of an up-and-down college career, at least his sophomore and junior years were concerned. He kind of turned it on a little bit this year. And he was a guy last week I basically tweeted, he's this year's Deidrin Snott, in my opinion. Small, squatty. He's a little bit bigger even. He measured in at 6'1", 327. But like Deidrin, I mean, he can control the gaps. He's got a good get off as well for a big man. And he was a guy that actually got promoted to this week at the Senior Bowl. So we'll see him at the Senior Bowl, and he had a great day today at Senior Bowl's practice. So those two guys in particular would definitely fit, kind of adding another D tackle. If Atlanta's not going to go there in round one, those are guys on day 2 right now that I think would fit in nicely with this scheme to rotate in with Sanat and Crawford and Jarrett. As far as some other guys, offensively, Terry Godwin is a guy I know all Falcons fans know from his days at Georgia. He took home offensive MVP. I'm not so sure. I haven't dived in too much to wide receivers. I don't know where he's falling. Probably day 2, day 3 range. But if they did want a speedster to stretch the field, a guy who's very nuanced in his route running, Terry Godwin is potentially in play. And then I think the other guy I'll throw out there, interesting player that definitely popped during the game, was B.J. Blunt from McNeese State. Only measured in at 6 foot, 203 pounds as a linebacker. But with the way the National Football League's trending as far as, these dime linebackers are concerned, B.J. Blunt's that type of guy, and he can fly around. He made a great play in coverage for an interception during the game. So a guy on day 3, maybe another dime in the rough like Foy Olakun, could potentially be the backup strong safety, perhaps in 2019, or a guy that maybe 5th safety because Niesman's likely to be back. He's a guy to keep an eye on, see what he does. Not sure he'll be invited to the combine. Hopefully, after his performance in the Shrine game, maybe he is, and you can see how he tests. But he was a guy that caught my eye that I wasn't familiar with or wasn't on my radar heading into the week.
Yeah. Those are some of the guys that I'm curious about. Like when you mentioned Blunt, sort of, I want to go back and see if I can find some of his stuff when he was at McNeese State, just because I do think sort of there's some potential there for what you mentioned, sort of him being sort of that backup strong safety and be more of a box strong safety in this scheme that the Falcons utilize, as opposed to asking him to be another undersized linebacker, because Deion Jones was sort of pushing it a little bit when he was sort of like 212 or whatever, coming to play linebacker. He's bulked up a little bit since then, but it's not as if he's done a great job maintaining that weight. And I think asking BJ Blunt to put on 20 or 30 pounds to play linebacker probably is not the best usage of his skill. Daniel Wise is a guy that definitely rose up the ranks and probably is going to be sort of in the 4th round range from what people have been saying, 4th, 5th round range. So an early day 3 sort of pick as a D tackle. Daylon Mack, you mentioned, I think you're right, sort of with the Deidre Senat comparison, which is partially why I don't know if the Falcons will be that interested in him, just because I think he's ideally more of a one tech, and I think the Falcons already have that spot sort of solidified with Deidre Senat. But at the same time, you can also make the case that beggars can't be choosers, and maybe drafting Mack and then asking Senat to dabble a little bit more at the 3 tech than we saw in his rookie season also makes sort of sense to get another sort of wide body in there. I think another player that stood out in the game that I heard wasn't necessarily a standout during the practice week was Jordan Brailford. Had a couple of sacks, the Oregon State edge rusher in the game. The issue with him, he's not particularly big. He's like 6'2", 241, doesn't have great bend, but he showed some decent get off in the game that was able to get effective pressure at times. So he's a guy that may be sort of a late round pass rushing, where at a certain point in the draft, usually starting around round 5, where you're just basically taking flyers on edge rushers and just looking for athletic upside at that point. So if he winds up testing well at the combine, or some of these other edge rushers that wind up testing well at the combine, you just sort of draft them late and hope that you can maybe develop those guys into something as a rotational player. Another guy that got the call up was Elon offensive tackle Oli Udo, who's a massive 6'6", 327. He's going to be at the Senior Bowl this week. Played right tackle at Elon last year, but sort of people, given his bulk, I've seen a little bit of him, and I haven't sat down and really, really watched him. But from what I've seen, I think you can sort of see a little bit. He moves pretty well for a guy his size. So in the idea that the Falcons are going to still continue with the zone, but be more of a quote unquote physical inside zone team, I could see the Falcons liking him as a potential right tackle candidate and possibly as a sort of maybe a guard guy, sort of as like a poor man's Brandon Brooks or something like that inside as a developmental guy. So he's another person that really stood out to me. A couple other D tackles that are worth keeping an eye on if they get combine invites and get the test. Rutgers D tackle Kevin Wilkins had a good practice week. Texas A&M, I mean not Texas A&M, Arkansas's Armon Watts. Those are 2 guys that keep an eye on, see how well they test, because those are some guys that I think also could be potential interior help on defensive line that could be in the day 3, 4, round 4, round 5, round 6 range. Matt, you have any other thoughts on the Shrine Game before we move on to the Senior Bowl?
I guess talking about a couple guys that I was a little disappointed with, or whose stock may have fallen a little bit. Landis Durham was a guy that I have my eye on as far as another edge rusher in the day 2, maybe early day 3 range. He weighed in at 249 pounds, was only 6'1". I was hoping for a little bit better than that. I've had him as a Brandon Graham, poor man's Brandon Graham comp. Super productive at Texas A&M. He didn't really stand out at all. I didn't hear anything about him during the practice week. Didn't see much of him making any plays during the game. So for me, I think he didn't help himself. And then Martez Ivy, kind of a guard tackle swing lineman from Florida. reports weren't great on him, and again, a lot of the offensive linemen in general in the game. You mentioned Udo; he was probably the one that did help himself, but other than that, a lot of the other guys there, it wasn't a great group, and they didn't really help themselves out, and he was kind of one of them that didn't do a whole lot to help his cause out. So he's probably a guy that's in that day 3 range and might not be more than a depth guy to start anyways. So those guys, and then the other notable for me, Ricky Walker, the D tackle from Virginia Tech, was a guy that me and Raekwon wrote up in our latest piece at Rise Up Reader. His arms were less than 30 inches, which usually is not a great sign for a D tackle. Now, I will say I was impressed with him at times, though. He did beat his man clean off the ball a few times in the game. So, the one comparison I'd make with him is Puna Ford last year was a very, now he had longer arms, I know that, but he was a shorter guy that the size concerns really kept teams away, and he ended up going undrafted. But he was great this year in his time in Seattle. So, maybe Ricky Walker, he'll have the same fate and he'll go undrafted. But I do think there's a player there that has put out some good tape. And again, he did play pretty decently in the game. But I do think his measurements are going to hurt his stock, and did hurt his stock this week.
Yeah, you don't see a lot of D tackles that have a lot of success that have arms that short.
No.
And in fact, I think looking at mock draftable, over the last 20 years, the shortest arm length they have is 30 inches and in 1/4. And he was like 29 and 7/8 or something like that. And like the last time I remember a pass rusher having arms that short, it was Bruce Miller, who they wound up moving the fullback. Now he wasn't a D tackle, he was a edge rusher, but he wound up being a pretty successful fullback for the 49ers for a number of years. So I do think that arm length is going to really hurt Ricky Walker in terms of his draft stock, because it just does not check any of the boxes that NFL teams look at. So he's going to really have to, I think, bounce back during the combine or during his pro day and really test well for teams to basically overlook that issue, because that is the type of measurable that I do think could wind up making you an undrafted free agent as opposed to a draftable guy. So he was a productive player. Virginia Tech flashed a lot of ability, and as you mentioned, was a guy that I think a lot of people expected to be the best D tackle among the Shrine game options, but just didn't necessarily stand out in the ways that some of the other guys that we mentioned before did. So we'll sort of see. It's certainly not over for him, but yeah, definitely he needs to compensate for the lack of arm length with a better combine in order to sort of get his stock back on track.
Yep.
All right, let's talk Senior Bowl. And, this is an interesting group, and you got a number, particularly in the areas of concern where we're focused on with the Falcons, with the offensive and defensive lines, particularly on the offensive line. I think you have a number of guys that are certainly projected to be potential top 50 picks, which is not always the case. You always get a couple of guys there, but it seems like there's probably, I wouldn't say a dozen, but 6 to 8 guys that you could realistically sort of see potentially being top 50 picks, particularly on the offensive line, and several other guys that certainly are going to be in the mix there on the defensive line. And I think how those guys perform this week will certainly solidify that in both cases. But Matt, go ahead and start us off on some of the guys that you got your eye on.
Yeah, so like you said, this is a who's who cast as far as defensive linemen and offensive linemen go. I mean, most of the top players, with the exception of a few, are here at the Senior Bowl, which you can't say that very often. So, for me, right off the bat, I'll start at the North offensive lineman. The guys I'm looking at, Michael Dieter, left guard, Wisconsin. I think with him, the thing I want to say is, we don't know right now how much power scheme Dirk Cutter is going to want to incorporate. For me, I think if this is going to work out, it has to be a blending. To ask Dirk Cutter to do something he typically hasn't done in his career, I think is asking for trouble. So, with that being said, Michael Dieter's a guy that does well in a phone booth and running the power scheme, but also does show enough athleticism. And I was pretty shocked when I saw his weigh-in today at 6'5", 304. he's definitely worked on his body to cut some weight. I mean, he was in the 320s, if I'm not mistaken, during his Wisconsin days. So I think he even sees that he needs to, cut down and be a little bit more athletic so he can kind of be more scheme versatile, but, still maintain that power. So he's a guy I'm looking at. Garrett Bradbury, the center for that North squad, perfect zone fit. I think he's going to end up being the best center of this class. Chris Lindstrom, the other right guard from Boston College. I think he's a plug and play from day one. And for me, I know this early, but as far as odds on choice for maybe that second round pick, that's the guy I'm looking at right now. And then lastly, on that offensive line for the North squad, Dalton Risner. The thing about him that I'm curious about is I think he is going to get the start at tackle. He played at right tackle the last 3 years at Kansas State. He has said that center is probably his more natural position because that's where he played up until his sophomore year. So I want to see how much dabbling they're going to have him do, both in the interior and at right tackle. But regardless, I think he's a perfect fit for the Falcons because they have both needs at either guard or at right tackle. And his arm length tested out. I think he was over 34 inches there. So, he'll be a guy to keep an eye on just from both spots. How does he hold up at tackle going up against some of these good edge rushers? And how does he do transitioning back to the interior? As far as the D lineman in the North, Charles Amenahu is a guy I think is rising. 6'6", 274 pounds, 36.5 inches arms. I mean, that's a freak. He's a Michael Bennett type of player. Can move up and down the line. I think he's going to be special, and I think he's already off to a good start this week with a good first day of practice today. Jalen Jelks is another one. I thought him tipping the scales at 250 helped himself because I wasn't sure he was in the 240s at Oregon. A guy that's played in the interior, kind of like how last year Hercules Mataafa was for at Washington State, kind of a tweener at 240, 250, Mataafa was, and played in the interior. Jalen Jelks kind of did a similar thing in Oregon. I don't know if that's going to fly in the NFL, so he'll be someone to watch this week. I think he's mainly playing on the edge, so keep an eye on him and see how he does there. And then the other one on the North D-line squad is Renell Wren, 6'4", 315 pounds, Arizona State. I think with him, kind of similar to Daniel Wise that I mentioned earlier, kind of played out of position at times or wasn't utilized, to the best of his abilities as far as, he's a one-gap penetrator, great get-off, and he wasn't asked to do that enough, I think, at Arizona State. And, if Dan Quinn could get his hands on him on day two, that's a guy that would fit seamlessly in this defense, again, at 3-tech. Now, he has been playing the nose tackle exclusively, they said today at practice, and was dominating there. So, again, he's a guy that's, again, can play up and down the line, explosive athlete. So, as far as rounding out the North squad, those are the guys I'm looking at there. How about we let you go for the South? Give your South takeaways.
Yeah, I mean, the South's got a couple of offensive linemen that I'm curious about. Andre Dillard's a guy was left tackle for Washington State. Very good feet. Measured in well, about 6'5", 310. I think his arm length was pretty good. I can't remember off the top of my head, but I think it was above 34 inches or something like that. So that's sort of what you're looking for as far as offensive tackles go. I kind of liked him watching him on film more as like a guard just because of how smooth and athletic he was. But from everybody talking, like he held up very well at offensive tackle. So he is a potential option, potentially in that sort of top 50 range, maybe a late first round, early second round type of guy if the Falcons wind up, looking for an offensive tackle after their initial pick. So he's in that mix. And again, I do think sort of also has the potential, not necessarily the experience, but to kick inside. And so if the Falcons do wind up, targeting a guy like him, you wouldn't necessarily be like, oh, plug him at right tackle, a position you never play. You could plug him at left guard, a position I don't think he's ever played. But two other guys from Oklahoma are Ben Powers and Drew Samia. Powers was the left guard there. Samuel was the right guard. I thought Samuel looked a little bit more explosive, a little bit more athletic on film. Powers was probably a little bit more consistent. And from what I heard, Ben Powers looked pretty good at practice today. So those are two guys that I'm sort of curious to look at up front on the offensive line. On the defensive line, you got Montez Sweat, who is this super long, super lean, 6'6", 252-pound guy with nearly 36-inch arms. If you saw the clip on Twitter, I certainly retweeted it. I'm sure many other people retweeted it today, where he basically put, I think it was Titus Howard, the offensive tackle, with a bull rush. Sweat was an interesting guy at Mississippi State, just because you see the tools, you see the athleticism, you see the upside, but you didn't necessarily see the consistency. So if he has a good week this week, people talking about him as a late first round sort of guy, and he could certainly solidify that, or he might slide to round two. But so far, based off of the early returns, at least watching some of the highlights, look like he got off to a good start. O'Shane Jimenez isn't a guy that I've watched a ton of at ODU, but he's one of those sort of second-tier pass rushers that I think is in the mix for as a potential option for the Falcons on day two. He's a little bit undersized, 6'3", 241, but was very productive at ODU and shined when he got opportunities to face some of the better competition. Jalen Ferguson, the guy from Louisiana Tech, is the NCAA all-time leader in sacks with 45. Interesting enough, he's also wearing number 45. I think there's probably a reason for that at practices today. So keep an eye on number 45 and remember 45 for 45 sacks. But, he measured in at 6'4", 256. I think he was listed at 270 or something, 265. So he came in a little bit lighter, I think, probably in part so he can show some quickness that people were a little bit skeptical of him having. But he's a guy also sort of in that same sort of Sweat Jimenez role, where you're talking about him potentially as a day two option. And a guy who got a recent call up, and I didn't watch his film this year at Florida State, but he was a guy that stood out to me when I did my summer scouting. DeMarcus Christmas, the 6'4", 302 D tackle from Florida State. He was a guy that I thought sort of flashed some potential. So he's a guy I'm going to try to keep my eye on this week. And before I let you go, Matt, I want to circle back to a player you did mention on the North squad. Anthony Nelson's another one of those guys, 6'7", 272. Big question to him is just how athletic he is, but in terms of sort of a refined pass rusher with length, I think he checks those boxes. So he's another guy that I think is in that sort of day two range. If the Falcons don't get an edge rusher in round one, go in another direction, whether that's D tackle, offensive line, or some other position, I think potentially with that 45th pick, Nelson's on the short list of potential candidates there, along with several others. And I think this week could be a good opportunity for several of these guys to potentially solidify themselves as borderline or firm top 50 picks.
Yeah, I think Nelson is a lot like another guy that's on that same squad, Zach Allen from Boston College. I think both of them, like you said, I think they have athleticism concerns. And is their best position on the edge or is it on the interior? So, I think, they're not going to be competing against each other per se, but there is a little bit of a competition maybe with them to see who the better option is as far as, being an edge rusher or being an interior guy. I still think, at least for Nelson, I've been seeing edge more for him as far as interior, whereas Allen, I think maybe would benefit more in the interior. But again, this is what this week's for, and keep an eye on those two guys. As far as just following up on some of your points on the South squad, Dillard is definitely a guy that I'm looking at. I liked him a lot on tape as well. I think he has some of the best footwork of this O-line class. For me, the concern is can he hold up from a strength standpoint? Oftentimes, I saw him get beat with bull rushes in games, and so I think that's where maybe a switch to the interior might make some sense. But at the same time, I think these are questions he can answer as far as can he hold up. And you mentioned Powers, you mentioned Samia. Those are two guys too that I've got my eye on as far as guards go. And then as far as the D ends, Montez Sweat, I think he's being slept on. I think he's every bit as good as, that Ja'Kai Polite, Brian Burns, and Josh Allen group. And I think he's going to showcase it this week, and he got off to a great start. I mean, he measured in tremendously. That was the one concern is, he does have a lean frame, but to be 6'6" and 252 when I thought he might be in the 240s, I thought that was a win for him. I thought Jalen Ferguson, too, weighed in well and helped himself there. I mean, kicking down from that 270, which to me, I was concerned how athletic is he. Now dropping down to 250, I think we're going to find out how athletic he is. And then lastly, you mentioned O'Shane Jimenez. I mean, he's one of my favorite players in this class. I think as far as from a technical standpoint, he knows what he's doing with his hands. But I was disappointed to see him weighing in at 241. I thought he would be hopefully in the 250s, 255, and that wasn't the case. So, he's going to have to make up for it, just like Ricky Walker is going to have to make up for his short arms. Jimenez is going to have to make up for it and continue to show, the technical side that he showed on tape this week at the Senior Bowl. Because, again, I like him on day two. Secretly, he's kind of been the guy of holding on hope in that third round range, that you take a D end and, you stick them behind. Hopefully they get a veteran free agent defensive end this offseason, and you can stick him behind that guy and tack, and you don't have to rush him into it. But he's a guy in the sub packages where, in the NASCAR looks, he can be a real factor and could have like a Carl Lawson type impact, from a day 2 pick, day 3 pick, right away. So again, those are guys to keep an eye on, see how they do as far as, making up for some of their, physical deficiencies, if you will, and, seeing if they increase or decrease their stock.
Yeah. Another position group I'm certainly going to keep an eye on. I don't know how much the Falcons are going to be invested in this position in the draft. I certainly think they can. I've certainly made the case that using a mid-round pick on a dynamic wide receiver will only enhance the Falcons' offense in the future. But one of my favorite wide receivers in this draft class is Deebo Samuel. He's going to be there from South Carolina. Andy Isabella is sort of your quote unquote classic Patriots wide receiver, 5'9", sort of slot receiver, but really showed off his speed. And, I think he was a all national track guy or whatever in high school.
Yeah, he beat
So it's
Denzel
not,
Ward in the 100
yeah.
yard dash. Yeah.
Yeah, so like he's not a guy that's like quicker than fast. He's actually legit fast. And if you've seen some of the clips from today's practice, you got to see some of his quickness and his explosiveness. Jacoby Myers from NC State, I think it was a former quarterback coming into college and played primarily in the slot. And NC State has some, Mohamed Sanu is a decent comp for him in terms of the size and the pass as a quarterback. And I think a couple other guys to throw out there that I have my eyes on. Gary Jennings from West Virginia, just a guy when I watched West Virginia this year, he was a guy that popped a couple of times. So he's a guy that I got my eyes on. But a couple of guys that have some return potential, just because I think the Falcons may be in the market for a return specialist if they do wind up taking a wide receiver in this draft. And someone who's a local guy from Georgia State, Penny Hart, another 5'8", 180-pound slot guy, but and some people said was even better than Isabella in terms of his speed and quickness. And another guy that's sort of a hybrid sort of player, which is Tony Pollard from Memphis. He got the late call up, and sort of he played wide receiver, running back, but primarily is probably going to be more of a return specialist. But in terms of sort of like, I won't compare him to David Johnson because I don't think he's going to be that good. But in the same way that David Johnson was kind of this tweener wide receiver running back during his days at Northern Iowa, I think you can say that Tony Pollard has similarities, at least as far as that concerned, not suggesting that he's going to be the same player. But in terms of being this sort of, if you play him at running back, you can sort of use him as a wide receiver. If you use him at wide receiver, he's going to be more of this sort of slot guy, but it's just sort of an offensive weapon is basically what I'm saying in terms, and also has some return value. So he's another guy that I have my eye on. Any other thoughts on this Senior Bowl crop before we get onto the mailbag, Matt?
I guess the only other thing is, I'm very intrigued by this tight end class. And the one name that, I'd say to keep an eye on is Foster Moreau. I think Foster Moreau, one of the best blockers in this class. And I think, if the Falcons are going to draft a tight end, because it's not really a need, it's going to have to be a guy that's going to help out in the blocking department. And Morrow can certainly sling it there. But I'm most intrigued by what he shows as a pass catcher, since he didn't really get a huge opportunity to do that at LSU because their offense, it's not very pass happy. They're more run based team. So keep an eye on him. I think, we know the Falcons love LSU players, and Foster Moreau could be that next LSU Tiger that gets drafted by the Falcons.
There you go. Christian Fulton. I'll throw the cornerback from LSU is okay. If I'm pegging one LSU guy as the Falcons pick, I might throw him in there. Let's get into the mailbag, and our first question comes from _Pasqualoni, who is AKA the #1 Rams fan on Twitter. Why is Ed Oliver falling in everyone's mock drafts? He was touted as a top 5 or better pick in any draft. Now everyone has him out of the top 10.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of reasons. I think one of the things it's like some analysts do, and there's a guy like Ed Oliver that's been on the scene now basically since he walked onto the University of Houston, being a highly touted recruit. Guys like that are going to tend to get nitpicked as the years go on, and you're going to find, the smallest of details. And then I think, a couple other things, that whole jacket gate thing where he got into it on the sidelines with his coach because, he was inactive for a game and he wanted to wear a jacket, but apparently there's some policy with the team where you're not allowed to wear a jacket unless you're suited up. So there's a little dust up on the sidelines. I'm sure that's going to get, scrutinized more than it should. And then I think also, a lot of these mock drafts you see are needs based. So guys are being pegged where they're, to teams that have a need for them. And if you look at the top, a lot of these teams don't necessarily need defensive tackles. The Lions at 8, they don't need defensive tackle. Who else? You got, the Buccaneers is probably that first spot where I've seen, might dabble with a D tackle at number 5 because apparently Gerald McCoy might be on the outs there. So again, there's a multitude of different factors, but I think that's probably, most of them. I know he also dealt with an injury at Oliver this season, so that has a part to it as well.
I think the main issue with Ed Oliver is size. I think NFL teams have this thing against small D tackles. And typically you see it reflected in guys that are short, 6 foot, 6'1". And consistently those guys stock fall. There are some exceptions to that, but for the most part, you see it with guys like Grady Jarrett and, Geno Atkins. And historically speaking, that's been a big issue. And I'm sure that contributed somewhat to Maurice Hurst's fall besides the heart issue. So I think it's not really Ed Oliver short. It's just, the question is, how big was he? And he was probably, people say that he was like 275, 280 at Houston this past year. And I think for now, that's going to be a concern. I think the question is going to be, what does he measure in at the combine? If he's 280 plus, 285, 283, I think those issues jump out the window. I think also if he tests as well as people think he's going to test and be this all-time tester, then I think all the talk of his stock falling, I think it's going to stop then and there. If he's going to test in the same way that Aaron Donald tested, or comparable to Aaron Donald as sort of this 99th percentile athlete or whatever at the D tackle position, then I think all the talk of his stock falling just goes away. And I just think that's more of it more than anything. But if he shows up at like 277, 6'2", 277, and then doesn't test as well as people fully expect him to, and just kind of has an average performance or decides to sit out, then you'll continue to hear this narrative. So ultimately, I think he's one of the elite talents of this draft class. I think he's one of the 3 elite talents of this draft class. I think he should be a top 3 pick. I think Nick Bosa and Quinn Williams are the only guys that you can say are better than him. But we'll see. Sort of, I think Matt is right. There isn't quite as big a need at the very tippy top of the draft as far as teams looking for D tackles, and particularly teams that probably are fine with 280-ish pound D tackles. A lot of those teams tend to prefer, the bigger guys, a team like Detroit or whatnot, where you get that Matt Patricia defense from New England that tends to like size more than necessarily explosiveness. So, at the end of the day, I would be surprised if he falls out the top 10, but you never know. Our next question is from NJ Falcons, Ronan at Mav2124, Ed Oliver or Jonah Williams.
It's Ed Oliver for me. I'm with you. I think he's a top 3 player in this class. And, for me, I'm just more set on trying to rebuild this defensive line to the point where, we get this defense to the vision of Dan Quinn when he came here. So adding a guy like Ed Oliver, you're basically adding another Grady Jarrett. So, yeah, sign me up for that.
Yeah, the answer is pretty easy. It is Ed Oliver if you have to choose between those 2 guys. But just to play a little bit of devil's advocate, I think Jonah Williams is a solid player. I think he's one of the few offensive tackles that I've seen so far in this class that I would be reasonably comfortable with stepping in day one and playing right tackle. That's where he showed up and was a true starter as a true freshman at Alabama as a right tackle back when Cam Robinson was the left tackle now in Jacksonville. And has been a steady performer throughout his career at Alabama. Sort of, his stock is questionable now because, again, it has to deal with size. How long is he? How tall is he? Is he 6'3", 6'4", or is he 6'5"? How athletic is he? I think he's a pretty good athlete. I don't think he's like an amazing athlete, but I think sort of his stock is sort of going to be depending on, whether he's a top 5 pick or slides into the late teens or 20s or whatever. It's going to depend on what he does at the combine. So he like Ed Oliver, I think, is going to be another guy that whatever the narrative is for them will be solidified come late February, early March, as opposed to right now where it's kind of all over the place. So I like Jonah Williams, but it's not even a conversation. Jonah Williams is not like arguably a generational offensive tackle prospect.
I mean, it's honestly like the 2014 draft. You're asking Jake Matthews or Aaron Donald. I mean, Jake Matthews is a great player. He's turning into one of the top tackles in the league now. But, if you have a shot to get a close to an Aaron Donald level player, you're going to go with that.
Yeah. And I don't think Jonah Williams is as good as Jake Matthews.
Oh, all right. I think that's his trajectory, though. I mean,
yeah, I think that's sort of, if you like Jonah Williams, that's what you hope he's going to be. But
yeah,
I think as a prospect, I think Jake was better. But maybe you can make the case that maybe if Jake's last name was Smith and not Matthews, maybe people wouldn't have been as favorable about him, given his bloodline. So
yeah,
it's fair. They're close, but yeah, I think basically you're right. Justin Sandu asks, who's your Super Bowl pick?
So, I mean, we talked about the storyline of this game as far as, 17 years to the day, Rams versus Patriots rematch. So I want to see the dynasty. I think we all want to see the dynasty end. And I think for it to end on the leg of Greg Zuerlein once again, for the Rams to have a game-winning field goal to beat the Patriots and hopefully end it, I'm going to go with the Rams, game-winning field goal.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of what I'm hoping to see, but I need to do a little bit more analysis. My initial thing is like, Well, the Patriots always seem to win these games. When
Yeah.
you're like, oh, well, this is going to be the team that beats the Patriots, and the Patriots find a way to win
I
it.
mean, the safe money's on the Patriots. Yeah.
Yeah,
Sure.
so like, I don't know. So like right now, I'm going to say Rams just because I want the Rams to win, and I feel like sitting here today that they have a pretty good shot, as good a shot as anybody does, which you think anybody that's in the Super Bowl has a pretty good shot at winning it. But so I'll go with the Rams, and probably a close one. I don't expect it to be the shootout like last year's Super Bowl was with the Eagles. Um, and let's just say I probably feel better about the Rams in this matchup than I felt about the Eagles last year, and the Eagles managed to win it. So that says something. That just could be I'm terrible at picking games, which is fair. But so I'll go with the Rams, probably similar to Matt with a sort of a game-winning field goal or last-second touchdown from
I think
Gerald Everett or something like that.
the one other little interesting nugget was that Rams Patriots Super Bowl 17 years ago was in New Orleans, and obviously we saw what the Rams did to have to go into New Orleans and win that game. So I don't know. I tend to fall for those types of things maybe a little bit more than I should, and um, the whole destiny and all that. So let's see. Hopefully it happens. But again, like you said, Patriots usually win these games. I am interested to see what type of game plan Belichick has for Goff, because I do think Goff, he's going to get some credit. He made some great throws in that New Orleans game, but for me, I still have a tough time trusting him in big
Yeah,
moments. He can
same.
get jittery. So going up against the ultimate mastermind in Bill Belichick, Goff's going to have to be on his A game if they're going to win.
Yeah, and it'll be interesting given how Todd Gurley performed. Normally,
Yeah, that too.
you expect with the Patriots, they're going to take away your best offensive weapon, and they
He basically
historically
did.
do a great job, and that would normally be Todd Gurley.
Yeah,
But if whatever his issues are, injury or whatever, if he's no longer that option, then who is it? Is it Brandon Cooks? Is it
right.
Robert Woods? And so then then you need to rely on somebody else, whether it's Gurley or whether it's Cooks or whether it's Woods or Gerald
And
Everett or
maybe that bodes well for them too, because not having that weapon these past few games, who does Bill Belichick try to stop? I mean, I guess he'd still go for Gurley, but again, they've been carried without Gurley the last couple games, so maybe that will work in their favor.
yeah, it's an interesting matchup. So yeah, more to come on that
Yep.
in future episodes. Andy at Falcons. Andy asks, are the only two options for Schrader right tackle or cut?
Assuming this, I mean, yeah, I don't think you're sliding him. If he's asking if you're sliding him inside to guard, I don't think so. But I haven't really. I mean, I think he could take a pay cut, but at that point, you know, are you really going to have him be a backup? So I think the options are kind of limited as far as his future is concerned. I don't think you're going to try to keep him on for that $7.7 million salary in 2019, and just going to cross your fingers that 28.
Okay. I don't know if we're having some technical issues, but I'm going to keep things going. Um, Basically, to answer Andy's question, we'll see if we can get Matt back. Um, but to answer Andy's question, I think for the most part, it is you keep Schrader or you cut him. I think there's an option to sort of redo his contract. But I think given his age and given sort of his decline, I don't necessarily know. You just might as well just get rid of him if you're so inclined to sort of bring him back at a cheaper contract. Either you go one of those two ways. So I do kind of think that's the only options, as Matt sort of intimated. I don't really think moving him inside the guard is really an option. You know, at his size, 6'7", you don't typically like tall guards. You know, the old adage of low man wins is sort of, you know, how that goes. Um, so I think, yeah, I think it's really going to be, can you do you feel adequate other options out to replace Schrader at right tackle, which you can make a case for, given that Ty Sambrailo was able to outplay him down the stretch, and there'll presumably be better options either via free agency or the draft than Ty Sambrailo, or you feel like, given the premium of that position, given the limited number of options that you may have in free agency in the draft, potentially, do you just basically, is it the lesser of two evils just to basically keep Ryan Schrader and have him compete at that right tackle spot with somebody else, whether that's Sembrelo or a newcomer, and just hope that, you know, 2018 was an aberration for him. But I think we have Matt back. So Matt, you know, I think the stream froze when you were talking last. So continue with your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, you know, for me, I think the options are kind of limited with Schrader. You know, I think, you know, you can cut him, obviously. I don't think you're sliding him inside the guard. I think he's going to be a right tackle. So it's either, you know, you ask him to take a pay cut, because to keep him on for that 7.7 million, you're not going to let him ride the bench at that salary. So he takes a pay cut. At that point, then, you know, are you bringing back Sembrilo? You drafting a rookie, and you have a three-way shot for that right tackle spot. Now, I think the thing with him, that, and I've written this in my article, as far as like who to cut, who to sign, and all that, you know, he's kind of been that June 1st cut for me. So, you know, you can bring him back. He would be on the books anyways till June 1st. So, I mean, you can do that. And then if you decide in camp that he got beat out by Sembrilo and the rookie for those first two, you know, right tackle spots, then at that point you can move on from him. I know, you know, from a professional standpoint, I don't know if the team would do that. I mean, usually, you know, a guy who's been with you for a couple of years, you want to give him an opportunity to try to catch on sooner in the off season with another team. But that's always an option. But yeah, for me, you know, it's either right tackle at a lower salary or he's likely gone.
Derek at D-Rock the Party asks, why is most of the talk about Schrader and particularly Alfred about cutting them instead of asking them to take potential pay cut this offseason? So we just talked about that with Schrader. So let's talk about Alfred.
You know, that's a very reasonable point. I do think one of the things, and, you know, I caught your show with Jeff Schultz on Locked On Falcons. I know he thinks that there's no possibility of that. He's either, you know, just like a Band-Aid, you're going to rip him off, he's going to be gone. So I think that's a lot of the talk behind that, is other sources are, you know, hinting at the same thing. And, you know, when you got a guy like Isaiah Oliver that you drafted in round 2 the year before, and who did show some positive results in the limited time he did to the field in 2018. You know, I think adding those two together, you're not going to want to bring him back at a reduced rate. And, you know, you got Casey that needs to see the field as well, and you're likely going to bring Brian Poole back on the restricted um, free agent tag. So, you know, the room becomes crowded at that slot corner position then. So, which is where, you know, Alfred would probably fit for the remainder of his tenure if he was to stay in Atlanta. So I think that has a lot to do with it, but I do think it's a fair point. I think that's probably where the negotiations need to start. But I think more than likely it's just going to be a swift cut.
Yeah, I mean, generally speaking, like last offseason was really the first time that we really saw the Falcons make efforts to restructure contracts. That's typically not what they do. Typically, their strategy is don't push cap issues into future seasons. We'll just cut bait now, or we just won't worry about it. So I think that's part of it, is why the expectation is that the Falcons will just outright cut those guys as opposed to redoing their contracts. But you never know. I think a lot of it also has to do with the fact that we expect changes with their offense, and with the team, and in terms of letting some players go this offseason. And I think part of it is sort of the unknown status of sort of what Grady Jarrett's situation is going to be, particularly with whether or not he's going to get the franchise tag if they don't get a deal done before March 13th or whatever, or March 2nd, I think is when the franchise deadline is, or whatever it is. Also, sort of the questions about whether the team is going to move on from Vic Beasley or restructure him or keep him at his salary. So there's going to be some moves where you think the Falcons are going to potentially free up some cap space. And I think because we're not sure what's going to happen with Jarrett and whether his franchise tag is going to be like a $13 or $14 million albatross over the Falcons salary cap this year, and then that's going to put more pressure on you to cut some guys to free up additional cap space to compensate for that. Or if you don't cut Vic Beasley and you keep him, that's essentially again another $13 million albatross on the salary cap that the Falcons could free up by cutting him, or not free up by keeping him. Essentially what you have then is, if you keep both of those guys, or if that's $26 million of cap space that you're not going to free up, you got to find some way to free up cap in other places. And just from that matter, cutting Schrader and Alford makes the most sense, more so than trying to restructure them and saving, $2 or $3 million each for those guys. And instead of taking, whatever, if it's $8 million for Alford and over $4 million for Schrader. So basically that's like the $13 million that you would gain from, that you would potentially lose from either keeping Beasley and or Jarrett.
Yeah, totally agree.
Andy at Falcons, Andy asks, what, if anything, are you expecting from Eric Saubert?
So I think we'll have a better idea of that, once the offseason ends. Because if they do draft a tight end, I'm probably not expecting much at that point. If they don't and they roll, into 2019 with Hooper and perhaps they bring back Paulson, which I think would make sense, and then Saubert as your 3, then maybe we're going to see more multiple tight end sets with Dirk Cutter's offense. I know I rewatched I don't know why I did this. I rewatched the 2012 NFC title game over the weekend just to remember what it was like to have Dirk Cutter as a play caller. And one of the personnel tendencies I noticed was he liked to flex the fullback out into the slot at times in the 21 personnel. So we saw Saubert dabble at fullback a little bit towards the end of the season, and maybe that's something that he can use Saubert as his H-back and flex him out in those situations to be more, multiple in the looks and catch the defense off guard, keep it in base personnel, which would be tough to defend that type of setup if that was the case. So, on one side, if that's the route if that's the side that they go where they're not going to address the tight end position in the offseason, then that's kind of what I'm expecting or hoping out of maybe Saubert in 2019. Because at that point, year 3, it's make or break for him. If he doesn't carve out a role, then he's probably not going to be anything long term in Atlanta. And then on the other side, if they do address the position in free agency, then maybe we shouldn't expect anything now from Saubert. So it'll be interesting, and I think the offseason will have a lot to say as far as what his future is in Atlanta.
Well, for me at least, I'm not expecting a whole lot from Saubert. I think he's a solid third tight end, but he didn't make the jump to the degree that I hope to see this season from year 1 to year 2. And sort of, I think that's often sort of, and I'm not going to write him off or anything like that, but typically the guys that do wind up lasting long-term in this league, typically you see a pretty big jump from them from their first year to the second year, particularly for the guys that have a quiet first year. And I just didn't really see that, particularly with Saubert's blocking. And I think he's a capable wide receiver. But it's just don't really think that's going to have a huge role in the Falcons offense. And I think obviously, and Matt certainly can attest to this, with this tight end class, there are better options potentially there that are going to be significantly better than Saubert that you can have in the middle rounds of this year's draft class. So like I feel like, basically keeping a spot warm because you're like, oh, well, Saubert's a good receiver. It's like, well, you can use a 4th-round pick and get a guy who's twice as good a receiver as Saubert is potentially. So I think Saubert's a solid number 3 tight end. I'll be curious sort of to see if the Falcons use more 2 tight end sets. That was a staple of Dirk Cutter in Tampa Bay, and also when he was in Jacksonville, not so much when he was in Atlanta. And I think if that's the case, then you'll sort of see similar to what the Falcons did in 2015 and 2016, where they carried 4 tight ends on the roster. Because if you're going to use a lot of 12 personnel with the 2 tight end sets and a healthy amount of 13 personnel, having 4 tight ends on the roster makes a lot of sense. And I think you can make an argument for why 2 tight ends also sort of being their more base offense as opposed to the 21 that they've been consistently using for the most part over the last 5-6 years, even dating back to the Dirk Cutter days. Is that if you do wind up going with like a rookie right tackle or some question mark at that right tackle position, or even another year of Ryan Schrader there, you might want to have another tight end in there to sort of help chip on that side of the ball before they release in the field, just to give that guy a little bit of help if you have question marks there. So I think you can make a case. This is one of the reasons why I would make a case for why I think tight end is a potential need. It's not necessarily a pressing need, but it is one of those spots where I do think there's an opportunity for the Falcons to make a significant upgrade. And I don't think right now, looking at Eric Saubert, there's any reason to be like, oh, that's not a need because of Eric Saubert. I think the question for me with the tight end position this offseason is, are you going to re-sign Logan Paulson to be the blocker? And if so, does that stop you from drafting a tight end in the draft? Or does, one of these talented tight ends that other years might be a day 2 pick slide to day 3 because it's so deep this year, and then you can sort of get a value in like round 4 or 5 with getting basically like a 3rd-round talent at that late in the draft process, and whether or not you're going to pull the trigger on that, given some of your other issues that you want to address in the draft as well. So basically, long story short, I just don't think Saubert, not to say that Saubert isn't in the team's plans, but I just don't think he really affects anything that you're going to do. You don't really consider him for any of the situations that you may wind up having this offseason at the tight end position.
Yeah, I mean, ideally, Saubert's the 4th guy. You can still bring Paulson back to be that 2nd or 3rd guy as the blocker. And then, yeah, I'm with you. I hope they look into this tight end class because I think it's one of the best we've seen in a while, and it will be one of the best in the future. So, even though it's low on the needs list per se, I do think they have an opportunity here to really add a special piece to their offense long term.
Derek at D-Rock the Party, I think 2 priority free agents the Falcons should sign this offseason are Brandon Graham at defensive end and Mark Lewinsky at right guard. What are your thoughts on signing them?
Yeah, I think that would be a great free agent haul. I'm huge on Brandon Graham. I think he's one of the guys that I have at the very top of my list. For me personally, they need to get an upgraded veteran defensive end, and Brandon Graham, being on his 3rd contract, he's in the Falcons ballpark as far as price. I don't think they can get one of these tier 1 guys that might be available, like a D Ford or a Trey Flowers. I think they have to be looking at guys that are either on their 3rd contract or on their 2nd contract, but they're a tier below the tier 1 guys like Zadarius Smith or Preston Smith. So those would be like my plan C. But yeah, if they can get Brandon Graham to, not only for the veteran leadership that he would bring, but I mean, the guy, don't just look at the box score when you're looking at Brandon Graham. I mean, he affects the plays. He affects the game consistently as well as any defensive end has the last couple of years. So I kind of get annoyed when people say, oh, well, look at the sacks. He's only a 5-sack guy. Well, Brandon Graham is much more than that. He's an every down player. He's a force in the run game. He would be a great plug-in guy to instantly upgrade that D-line. So I'd love him. Olivier Vernon's the same type of guy. I'm hoping Giants are expected to cut him. He would be a guy that fits into that realm. And then as far as Glowinski, I think it's a great fit. Former Seattle guy. a top spark athlete from that 2015 draft class. So expectations are there's going to stay with a lot of the zone blocking elements. He's going to fit in well there. I guess the only thing I hope getting a guy like Glowinski wouldn't stop them from investing heavily though in the interior. And I know you're probably well, like Matt, why didn't you think like that a couple years ago, more or less? Because I was always saying that you can get a guard later in the draft, especially with the zone blocking scheme. But I think we're at a point where they've done the whole veteran patchwork type of game, and I think they need to just start sinking younger pieces, younger assets into this offensive line, because who knows how much longer we're going to have with Alex Mack. We might have one more good season to really look forward to. So they got to start, honestly, these next couple years adding a piece at the top of the draft every year. So, I'd love a guy like Glowinski. I think it would be a great fit. Maybe you swap out Fusco's contract and you replace it with Glowinski, but I still think that they need to invest in the interior offensive line, whether they get a guy like Glowinski or not. So, yeah, I mean, it's a great free agent haul, but hopefully that doesn't change their draft philosophy if they were to get a guy like that.
Yeah, for people that doubt Brandon Graham, just go back and watch the Week 1 game against the Eagles and watch like the last 6 plays of that game, and just watch Brandon Graham just cook Braden Fusco for 6 straight plays. So if people doubt his ability, he is a quote unquote pressure guy as opposed to a sack artist, but he has been consistently one of the most productive in terms of creating pressure, and it's not just like Vic Beasley pressure where it's like he gets in the vicinity of a quarterback. No, he's actually affecting the quarterback with Brandon Graham's pressure. So he too is at the top of my sort of wish list as potential upgrades at the DN spot. And you also got to like the fact that last season in particular, I don't know that much if he did it this year due to the presence of guys like Michael Bennett, but he also can play inside, which he did in that Week 1 game quite a bit. So he can sort of be that quote unquote Michael Bennett guy that we've been desperately talking about the Falcons adding for 4 off seasons now, and they have never done so. So he, fifth time's a charm, I guess, maybe. So I think Brandon Graham has every reason to be at the top of a lot of people's wish lists. And you're right. I do think because of his age and seemingly the perception around him, he probably won't command as sort of high a salary as some of these other potential guys or other guys like a DeMarcus Ware, what he got from Denver on the back end of his career a couple of years ago. So I think relative to what he can contribute, he might wind up being a bargain. As for Glowinski, he was a guy that I certainly had my eye on when he was coming up to the draft. He wound up going to Seattle, did not have a lot of success there. How much you want to blame that on Tom Campbell, you can certainly choose to do so. Then kind of went to Indianapolis last year as sort of a guy out they picked up off the street, and then they sort of plugged him into the starting lineup this year permanently, and he had a pretty solid season. I do wonder, though, a little bit because Indianapolis plays a little bit more of that man blocking scheme than necessarily this sort of zone that we run, whether or not that was also a contributing factor to why Glowinski sort of turned things around. So I wonder if you put him back in the outside zone, which he obviously has experience playing in and certainly has the athleticism to play in. Do you see a drop off in his production from where he was this year, where he was a solid, not great, but a solid right guard? And certainly based off of how he performed in Indianapolis this year, you would look at that and say that's an improvement over what the Falcons had at the right guard position. So I'm a little more skeptical of Glowinski, but certainly at this point, beggars can't be choosers. And if the Falcons do decide to sign him, I'm not going to complain about it. I just wonder a little bit whether or not you're going to expect a little bit of a step backwards just because he's doing things a little bit differently than what he did when he had most of his success in Indianapolis, and it would be doing more things than comparable to what he did in Seattle when he wasn't necessarily having as much success. So that would be my only question about Glowinski. But then again, I think if you're only paying a small price for that, then it's a risk worth taking. So yeah, I would be in favor of that signing. It's hard for me to sit here and be like, oh, any signing the Falcons make on the offensive line, I would complain about. Certain players I'd probably be like, well, we'll see if they're an upgrade or whatnot. as opposed. And I think it's fair to question that with Glowinski, but we'll have to see. Our last question comes from Brian, at your homeboy Brian. He asks, how do you feel about our running back situation moving forward? Do you think Devontae Freeman and Ito Smith will do well under Dirk Cutter's scheme? Would Tevin Coleman be good for Cutter's screen passes? Do you think Cutter will use our backs more creatively than Sark did?
Yeah, I think the running back room's a strength heading into 2019 with the Falcons, and I do think both those guys, Devontae Freeman and Ito Smith, will do well under Dirk Cutter. I think Dirk Cutter did have a lot of success, or you could say what he did run as far as from a zone blocking scheme standpoint was that inside zone, and I think that fits right into the wheelhouse of Freeman and Smith. So in that regard, I think this will be the first time since the Maurice Jones-Drew Jacksonville days where Dirk has running backs like this. I mean, he did have, I guess, Doug Martin for one season in Tampa before he got hurt, but now consistently he has a couple guys that can tote the rock and can do so effectively. So as far as the running game is concerned, look, with Dirk Cutter, I think the thing with me was just, I don't know how much improvement as far as from what Sark did the last 2 years we can expect, but we're still going to have a great offense. It's still going to be, top 5 to 7 offense. And I think a lot of the running game boils down to improving the personnel, which we all hope that the Falcons do in the offseason as far as the offensive line is concerned. So I think the running game is going to be fine. As far as Tevin Coleman being good for Cutter's screen passes, I guess I think Cutter's screen passes, though, were, well, I guess, I'm trying to think back on those Cutter days in Atlanta. I mean, Quiz Rogers was the beneficiary of a few dump offs. But I don't think it's anything, you're not going to miss anything with Tevin Coleman that Devontae Freeman and Ito Smith can't give you in that regard. So, I think we're fine at running back. I think Cutter's going to be able to use those guys effectively, more effectively than Sark. I mean, I guess we'll find out, but yeah, I'm not concerned. It's one of the positions I'm least concerned about. I think Brian Hill even showed some stuff at the end of 2019 that got me a little excited to see more of him. So yeah, I think we're good there. Maybe they'll look to add a day 3 change of pace type of guy, but if they don't, I'm not going to lose sleep over that.
Yeah, I'm not too worried about the running back position. We'll see sort of what Freeman's status is next year. We'll see sort of what growth Ito Smith shows next year. But running back, infamously is sort of a dime a dozen type of position. So even if those guys disappoint you in some way, whether it's their inability to make improvements or their inability to stay healthy and be on the field, you can realistically expect the Falcons to get somebody decent off the street. You see that with Damian Williams with the Chiefs. You saw that a couple of years ago with Alex Collins with the Ravens. The Falcons basically almost had a shot at Mike Gillislee like 2 years ago, and he wound up going elsewhere. But basically the point is that of any position on the field on the football team, you can realistically, more so than any other position, expect that you can basically get a competent, capable player off the street at running back more so than probably any other position. So I'm not too worried about in terms of do the Falcons need to shore up that position. But, I have seen some running backs in this draft class that I'd be like, oh, that guy would be a fun Falcon, but it's not necessarily a need as far as I'm concerned. I'm not too worried about Cutter's scheme integrating with these running backs. I think we'll still see a lot of outside zone. I think when you have guys like Freeman and Smith, Freeman we know runs the outside zone very well. Ito Smith, I guess that's a little bit up in the air just because we didn't quite run it to the degree that we normally had in previous years, this past year when he was on the field. But you certainly has the skill set. People basically compared him to a faster version of Devontae Freeman when he was coming out of Southern Miss. I certainly made those comparisons from time to time. So I feel like you're still going to utilize the outside zone to a significant degree. How significant is, to me, the question, just because you have those two players. So I don't expect sort of this wholesale scheme change as far as the running game is concerned. I think the one issue that Tevin Coleman brings to the table that you're potentially going to miss if you do lose him in free agency, which I think all of us or most of us expect to see happen, is sort of his dynamic speed in terms of sort of on wheel routes, which we saw from time to time and was very effective when he got those opportunities over the last couple of seasons. And, something we haven't really seen since that 2016 season, but his ability, at least in theory, to line up in the slot and really create mismatch and problems with his ability to get down the field and down the seam and whatnot. Again, we never really saw that during the Sarkisian days, and probably I wouldn't necessarily expect to see that during the Cutter days. But I think Coleman certainly brings a certain skill set that is extremely valuable in this league, but I do think it's not necessarily necessary in terms of what the Falcons are probably going to try to do on offense, but certainly is definitely a bonus to what they could do in terms of the mismatches. But that was a legitimate concern and criticism of Sark, not necessarily taking full advantage of those guys' skill set. And, sitting here today and again, guessing, but I wouldn't necessarily expect Cutter to do the same in terms of taking advantage of those guys. So I don't know if you're going to really miss Tevin Coleman in that regard either. So I think for the most part, our running back situation is pretty solid. Could be better, but nothing to lose any sleep over.
Have you thought at all about where you'd like to see Tevin Coleman land or where he might end up on the free agent market?
No, I haven't really thought about it. I'm trying to quickly think. No, I haven't thought about it, so I don't have an answer for you.
Gotcha. Yeah, I was thinking a few teams. That the Oakland Raiders come to mind as far as a team that, Charlie Garner was a player that John Gruden from the early 2000s liked to get the ball in the pass game. So I could see him winding up there. I don't know how much cap space they have. I would assume they have a lot, right? So
it seems likely, but yeah, I haven't checked. I don't think it's as much as they usually have, but I'm pretty sure they're comfortable.
So that would be just my wild guess on where I can see him going. But
sitting here thinking about it now, you're talking about it. Like Le'Veon Bell is the big catch this offseason at the running back position. And a lot of people sort of connecting the dots between him and the Jets because the Jets have a ton of money to spend. And certainly they have an ownership group that is not, is fine with big name players. So whoever is the other team that basically loses the Le'Veon Bell sweepstakes, whether that's the Jets or another team, I would guess would probably be the front runner to secure Tevin Coleman services, just because I think when you look at this free agent crop, there's a lot of good running backs, but several of them are coming off of down seasons. So I think you can make a case that Tevin Coleman's going to be the consensus number 2 running back in the free agent class, even though he arguably also is coming off of a down season. But I think it just his talent and upside is going to be attractive to certain teams. So basically, whoever doesn't get Le'Veon, whoever's in the Le'Veon Bell market or people think is going to be in the Le'Veon Bell market and doesn't get Bell, I think probably is a good landing spot for Tevin Coleman.
And I do think he benefits too from the fact that, while this running back class might have, the guys on day 2, day 3, I don't know if you can expect an impact player year 1 like you could get from Tevin Coleman. So I think even though, like you said, he had a down year and maybe his stock took a hit a little bit in certain points, I do think the fact that there isn't any running backs out there that you can necessarily expect maybe like you could in years past with the McCaffreys and Zekes and Fournettes, I think that's going to help him. So, I'm interested. That's something I'm going to be following because I want to see him do well. I'm curious to see how he would do with a different offensive mind because that one of the complaints was not using Tevin Coleman well enough with Sark. So I'm curious to see if another offensive mind can have as much luck as Kyle Shanahan did.
Yeah. So there you have it, guys. That is our show for tonight. We apologize for any of the technical issues that we had, but it tends to pop up on the show from time to time. And, we came at you guys an hour earlier than usual, and that's an option that we will leave the door open. We're going to discuss it. as something that may be a regular thing moving forward throughout this offseason. Tuesdays at 8 as opposed to Tuesdays at 9. But definitely, if you want to keep up to date when we do the show, you should definitely follow the show's Twitter handle, Falcons PFC, as well as check out the Facebook page, which is Falcons Central Radio. I am at FalcFans on Twitter. Matt is at Matt Karoly. That's Karoly. Use the hashtag Falcons mailbag to submit your questions. Of course, you want to follow the show on YouTube, subscribe, hit that bell icon. That's Pro Football Central on YouTube. Matt, I know you dropped your draft preview, so go ahead and plug away and whatever you got coming up during the offseason.
Yeah, so last week, Raekwon Gilbert and myself, we did a collaborative piece on, draft prospects. We went through 30 and kind of categorized them on day 1, 2, and 3 at 6 of the positions in need: offensive line, defensive line, linebacker, corner, and tight end. So that's at Rise Up Reader. You can check it out. Send some comments, roast me. I know, admittedly, I think I did get one player wrong as far as Jawan Taylor. Probably have him. It was my choice to bump him to day 3. I think he's going to be probably a fringe day 1, if not, early day 2 tackle from Florida. But so take a look at that. And as far as coming up, I don't have anything in store. Kind of tends to get busy for me at work right now, but I will be back writing around probably April, coming up the draft and free agency. But like Aaron said, we'll probably be doing a weekly or bi-weekly show. So you can catch the takes here and on Twitter. So follow along.
All right, guys. We'll be back next week talking probably our takeaways from the Senior Bowl and looking ahead to more offseason talk and takes and whatnot. So we'll talk to you guys then.